The hearing will come to order. We have votes that are coming up, so we're going to try to get through our opening statements, General Ham's opening statement, and then return for questions. So the subcommittee meets today along with members of the full committee to receive testimony on the findings and recommendations of the National Commission on the Future of the Army. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panel, General Carter Ham, U.S. Army retired Chairman of the Commission appointed by Chairman Thornberry, and the Honorable Robert F. Hale, the Commissioner appointed by Ranking Member Smith. Mr. Hale was also the lead for the Commission's Subcommittee on Aviation Issues. The Congress was prompted to form the Commission in large part over two major concerns. The first was how the Army should best organize and employ the total force in a time of declining resources. The second was whether the Army should proceed with the transfer of AH-64 Apache aircraft from the reserve components to the regular Army as directed by the Army's Aviation Restructure Initiative, ARI. The Commission reported its findings to Congress and the administration on January 28, 2016, and made 63 recommendations, 19 of which were directed towards Congress for potential action. This will provide the committee with enough time to review the recommendations as the committee prepares to mark the National Defense Authorization Act for 2017. In considering recommendations, the Commission was instructed to take into account, quote, anticipated mission requirements for the Army at acceptable levels of national risk in a manner consistent with available resources and anticipated future resources. I want to underscore those last two because it's a significant limit upon the Commission's view, and that was available resources and anticipated future resources. Consequently, the Commission assumed that the Army budget is flatlined at the FY16 presidential budget levels. The Commission has indicated that a total force Army of 980,000 soldiers is an acceptable level of risk, but is the lowest total end strength the Army can go given mission requirements and the current Defense Strategic Planning guidance. Again, the Commission did not consider the potential for budget increases over the amount of the fiscal year 16 presidential budget. However, the Commission did acknowledge that the current defense guidance does not include emerging threats such as Russian aggression and the growing threat of ISIL. The Commission then further notes that perhaps, quote, their greatest concern is the inadequacy of that guidance. We've heard senior military leaders testify before this committee that our military is operating at the ragged edge and that current assumptions in the defense guidance are rosy at best. Here's what we know. The Army is being asked to do more with less. Demands from the combat commands for Army capabilities and capacity continue to increase. The world security environment is considerably worse now than when the Department conducted its most recent quadrennial defense review in 2014. Going beyond just Russia and ISIL, North Korea conducted another ballistic missile test over the weekend. The Army has soldiers deployed in over 140 countries. The Army has provided over 1.5 million troop years to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan since 2001. And the Army has nearly 100,000 soldiers committed to the Pacific and continues to deter aggression in the Korean Peninsula. However, despite these demands, the Army has continued to downsize and budgets have been reduced. I hope today we can engage in candid discussion regarding total Army force capability and capacity as compared to the current and emerging threats. I want to briefly touch on the Army's Aviation Restructure Initiative, or ARI. Originally, the ARI had proposed numerous changes to Army aviation capacity, including the transfer of all Apache helicopters out of the Army National Guard to the regular Army. The Commission examined 3 comprehensive options for the Army's ARI, and we look forward to hearing more details about their final recommendations. This should also provide a great opportunity for the committee to gain a better understanding of the Commission's views in how to better utilize the reserve components. Before we begin, I would like to return to my good friend and colleague, Nikki Tsongas, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to our witnesses. I appreciate you both being here. The National Commission on the Future of the Army had an ambitious task, and I commend the commissioners, the 2 of you, and their staff for the work they put into this report. I'd also like to thank the chairman for opening the hearing to the full committee, as these topics impact the men and women of our Army stationed across the country and around the world. As many of us in this hearing have heard before, the Army is being asked to do more with less against an array of diverse and complex global threats. These constraints require the Army, the Department of Defense, and Congress to closely examine the appropriate distribution of active Guard and Reserve forces, as well as the right mix of capabilities needed to defend the United States and its allies. Today's challenges also require the Army to ensure that it is optimizing the performance of its soldiers to see that they remain the best trained and best equipped force in the world. The Commission's recommendations appear to fall into three broad categories. First, the Commission made specific recommendations regarding the size, location, and composition of the Army. Second, the Commission report makes many recommendations on how to further integrate the reserve components of the Army, the National Guard, and Army Reserve with the regular Army. Finally, the report includes recommendations on the future of Army aviation, and in particular, the question of where Apache helicopters should reside. I look forward to hearing more details about how the Commission reached its conclusions on all these topics. I'd also like to hear more about the cost associated with the Commission's recommendations. If Congress chooses to pursue any of the recommendations in the report, the money will have to come from somewhere, either within the Army or from another military services budget. Fully understanding these potential trade-offs is a critical part of considering the Commission's recommendations. These are not easy decisions to make, and I appreciate the opportunity to have a robust debate here in Congress on the way forward. I look forward to hearing more about how you arrived at some of your key recommendations. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Tsongas. I ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate in today's hearing after all subcommittee members have had an opportunity to ask questions. Is there objection? Without objection, non-subcommittee members will be recognized at the appropriate time for 5 minutes. With that, General Ham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Tsongas, thank you very much on behalf of all my fellow commissioners and the great staff that supported us. I thank you for inviting me and Secretary Hale to testify before the committee on our report on the future of the Army. The committee and your staff have already received the Commission's report, so I won't spend a lot of time addressing specific points, but I would like to give you a sense of how we approached the task that you gave to us in the fiscal year 2015 National Defense Authorization Act. The Commission made every effort to be inclusive, accessible, and transparent. We visited 17 states and interacted with over 320 different Army units across all three components. We interacted with all 54 adjutants general and with 33 governors. About 80 members of Congress engaged with the Commission as well, and we met with all 6 geographic combatant commanders and many of our most important allies and foreign partners, and that, frankly, is only a partial list of our engagements. As Chairman Turner indicated, we paid strict attention to the law you passed creating the Commission. Importantly, our recommendations had to be consistent with, I quote, acceptable levels of national risk and anticipated future resources. In other words, we simply were not unbounded in our work. The result is a set of 63 specific recommendations that we believe are well researched, based on realistic assumptions and backed by solid data. First, America's Army is the best in the world. Those who wear the uniform deserve our gratitude each and every day. But even those great men and women serving in uniform, the Army faces severe challenges, many of them budget-driven. From fiscal years 2010 to 2015, overall defense spending declined 7%, but Army funding declined 14%. On the 2 main issues before the Commission, force size and mix, and the Apache transfer, the Commission found the following. An Army of 980,000 is the minimally sufficient force to meet current and anticipated missions at an acceptable level of national risk. Within that 980,000, the Commission finds the regular Army should be 450,000, an Army National Guard of 335,000, and the Army Reserve at 195,000 represent the right mix of forces and, again, the absolute minimum levels to meet America's national security objectives. To fully understand this recommendation, it's important to remember again the mandate that you gave us. We were tasked to size the force in light of the 2 previously mentioned considerations, acceptable risk and anticipated resourcing. Adjust either or both of those, and you would reasonably arrive at very different conclusions. In our assessment, an Army of 980,000 is again the absolute minimum, a floor not a ceiling. On the Apache question, the Commission recommends the Army maintain 24 manned Apache battalions, 20 in the regular Army and 4 in the Army National Guard. The Commission recommendation has advantages over the Aviation Restructure Initiative in both wartime capacity and surge capacity, and it will reduce peacetime deployment stress. It will also, in our view, promote better integration of the regular Army and the Army National Guard. To offset the cost of having 4 Apache battalions in the Guard, the Commission suggests that the Army add only 2 Black Hawk battalions to the Guard instead of the 4 that are currently planned, and we recommend some slowing of Black Hawk modernization. The report also contains several prominent themes based on the Commission's fact-finding and analysis. The Commission considers sustaining the all-volunteer force vital to the future of the nation. A return to a draft or other model of compulsory military service will not yield the quality Army the nation requires. But an all-volunteer force is expensive to recruit and retain. We believe doing so is the right choice. The Commission believes it is critically important to develop a true total force culture. While the regular Army, the Army National Guard, and the Army Reserve are distinct, essential, and interdependent, they are meant to operate as one force, with their efforts fully integrated. We found gaps and seams that exist in the implementation of the total force policy, and our report highlights some of those and offers some remedies. For example, we recommend putting all Army marketing under one office, fielding a consolidated pay and personnel system, and making changes to the existing Section 12304B authority that will make it easier for the Army to employ the reserve components. The Commission recommends funding at the President's fiscal year 16 level, which would provide the Army with the minimum resources necessary to meet its requirements at acceptable levels of risk. But given the evolving strategic environment and the potential for growing instability, even this level of funding may prove inadequate. Additionally, Army funding must be predictable. Successive years of budget uncertainty and continuing resolutions have had significant negative consequences for the Army. It should be understood that, in the Commission's view, even with budgets at the President's budget for fiscal year 16, the Army would still suffer from some significant shortfalls in aviation and short-range air defense, as well as other capabilities that we address in the report. That's a very brief rundown of what we found. Certainly not everyone will agree with our recommendations. Indeed, many have already voiced their disagreement. What I do hope, though, is that our report will contribute to the important debate that you and the Congress and the administration and the Army, indeed the nation, must have to determine how America's Army should be sized, trained, modernized, and postured. With that, Secretary Hale and I are prepared to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, General. It is our honor to have our chairman with us today, and I recognize Chairman Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take a moment, and I know I speak on behalf of Mr. Smith as well, to express our appreciation to General Ham and to Mr. Hale for their willingness to serve on this commission, as well as the work that the commission has done, as well as the staff that have made all this possible. I think that y'all have done exactly what we asked you to do in answering some very specific questions. But as General Ham was just referring, you have also set up some of the larger discussion that we need to pursue, such as how we make sure all the components of the Army work together in a total force. So I think this is very good and very important work, and I just want to express appreciation to the work of the commissioners and the staff. In a relatively short amount of time, you've dealt with some very big issues. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of you for the work that you've done, and it is incredibly helpful to us. We also need to look at it in the context of the limitations that you were given in putting the construct together. And so with that, General Ham, I have a question for you. It wasn't within your charge. You were constrained and limited by budget caps. But I would ask if you could opine, if Congress did have additional funds to allocate, would you recommend that Congress stop the Army drawdown? General Ham.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. As the Commission did not look at that issue specifically, let me speak personally rather than as chairman of the commission. It is my view that that with additional funding, were additional funding to be available, some of the capability shortfalls that we mentioned in the report, some in aviation, short-range air defense, missile defense, military police, wheeled vehicle transport, and some other capabilities would be highly beneficial to the Army and would reduce the risk that we assessed given the size of the force that we recommended. So I think that's where additional capability, additional capacity would buy down risk over time. And maybe Secretary Hale has some thoughts.
May I add briefly on the budget side of this? The budget that was released yesterday has less resources, as I think you all know, for the Army and DOD than was in the fiscal year 16 budget plan, and by a significant amount. So we're already off the track that the Commission assumed in terms of funding for DOD, and I think the Commission felt strongly we need to get back on that track in 18 and beyond, in 17 if that's possible.
Thank you. General Ham, of course, I'm referring to the total force drawdown numbers. In your report, you've said what the force needs to do, and you've said what some of the threats are as to how that force can be utilized. But as you know, the total force drawdown is based on budgetary constraints that you were given. If Congress had the resources and we could stop the drawdown of the total force numbers, should we?
Mr. Chairman, I believe doing so would be wise, and it would afford the Army the opportunity to gain some of those capabilities that are currently in shortfall. The one caveat that I would offer, Mr. Chairman, is it's not just about the size. The size is important, but the size of that force, that Army must be properly modernized, trained, and resourced. So it's not just the numbers.
Right, General, if I can interrupt you for just a second. I understand that what you're saying is that in addition to having the force numbers, you have to have resources, you have to have training, you have to have capability for those force numbers. But I appreciate your statement that the total force number does matter, and that if we had the resources, your recommendation would be that we not draw the force down, but that we also, in addition to it, adequately equip it, train it, and provide it with capability.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. I agree with that.
Thank you. I have one other question, then I'll turn to Congresswoman Tsongas. Looking to Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, Commanding General of Army Europe, has stated that there used to be 300,000 soldiers in Europe during the height of the Cold War. Today we have 30,000 distributed all over Central and Eastern Europe with the same mission, to assure our allies and to deter Russia, just like we did in the Cold War, according to General Hodges. There's a big difference in capability and capacity between 300 and 30,000. General Ham, could you elaborate on the Commission's reasoning for recommending number 14 to realign an ABCT back to Europe? And could you give the committee your thoughts on whether this should be a permanent station or a rotational unit?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Our recommendation is that an Armored Brigade combat team be forward stationed, assigned to Europe rather than the current model of rotational forces. Rotational forces are certainly capable and offer a lot to the command, but it was our assessment that stationing an Armored Brigade combat team in Europe has two effects. One, it conveys a sense of permanence and commitment, which is helpful both in deterrence and in assurance. But secondly, we found in a larger sense that the regular Army's 9 Armored Brigade combat teams are totally consumed in the current rotational model, which has rotational Armored Brigades to Korea, that basically is 3 to make 1, to the Mideast, 3 to make 1, and Europe, 3 to make 1, which means all 9 Armored Brigade combat teams in the regular Army are committed, leaving no capacity for an unforeseen contingency. If the Army were allowed to forward station an Armored Brigade combat team in Europe, that would provide not only positive effects on deterrence and assurance, but would provide some residual capacity to the Army for an unforeseen contingency.
Thank you. We're going to pause. Votes have been called. I thank both of you and for your patience, but we'll be returning for additional questions after the votes. That will be adjourned. Recess.
just needs to.
Thank you. We'll resume the hearing and turn to Congresswoman Zongas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up. You've issued 63 total recommendations, and close to 20 of those were directed towards Congress that we needed to act. But I'm curious how you would rank order them, if there are some that you see more pressing and others that could be addressed later. And I'll start with you, General Ham.
Thanks, ma'am. We purposely did not prioritize the recommendations, but I think I'll offer my thoughts on ones that perhaps might require a little more attention than others. For me, it would begin with the very first recommendation that says maintain and sustain the all-volunteer force. And clearly, Congress's role in that is absolutely essential. I think, frankly, if we don't do that, the rest of it almost doesn't matter, because we've got to have the quality women and men to join the Army that are necessary. Secondly, I would emphasize the Congress's role in assuring predictable and responsible budgeting for the Army. I think that is absolutely vital to give that element of stability and predictability to the Army in its funding processes. Thirdly, there are a number of recommendations that address specific actions that cause the total force policy to be implemented more fully. Some of those require some legislative change, and so I would group those total force recommendations perhaps as a next priority for the Congress to address. And then again, just the larger recommendation with regard to the size and readiness of the force, the 980,000 at required levels of readiness, I think that would obviously also rank very, very high.
Secretary Hale, would you agree with that, or would you have a slightly different?
No, I agree with that. I want to underscore the need for predictable budgets. This turmoil is just eating the time of senior leaders and the Congress, I might add. Let me just give a couple of examples of the last theme that General Ham raised, and that is integrating into the total force. I think the Apache recommendation actually fits within this category, in that if you follow the Commission's recommendation, there'll be one other area of connective tissue between the Guard and the regular Army. But the recommendations on multi-component units are also, I think, very important. The Army's already doing this, but I think the Commission believes they could do more. And we made some specific suggestions for a pilot program in aviation that could lead to more multi-component units. And there are a number of others like integrated recruiting. So there are several, I think, specific ideas that fit within the theme that General Ham raised of integrating the regular Army and the Guard in a better manner.
Did you identify costs associated with that integration, and how did you, or not, and if so, how would you pay for them? Were there trade-offs you would make in favor of that, moving forward in that way?
Ma'am, the one area where we tried to address costs specifically and some trade-offs was in the aviation realm. For the other recommendations, we did not, frankly, time and capacity of the staff and expertise, we did not have the time to offer specific cost findings with many of the other recommendations. I'm seated next to the cost expert, as you know.
So,
A title I'm trying to shed.
Mr. Secretary, you might have some off the top of your head idea of cost.
No, I think I won't go there. But I will say in the aviation area, we did do costing there that Congress specifically tasked us to look at the Apache transfer. And although the Commission's recommendation adds to capacity and to peacetime capabilities, it does add to costs, about $165 million a year in operating costs and around $400 million in one-time procurement costs. And we did offer what we called an illustration of ways to offset that cost through a slight decrease in the size of the Black Hawk fleet and a modest slowdown in the modernization of the fleet. It's not that Black Hawks aren't important, they are, but they're a large fleet, and we felt that it was more important, if there had to offset the costs, it was more important to accomplish the Apache transfer, even if some offsets had to be made. And there were some other general offsets that were discussed as well. So We certainly paid attention to costs, although as General Ham said, outside of aviation, we did not specifically cost each option.
At least it's an acknowledgement that there are costs associated with this, and that in the world of constrained resources, that as we move forward, we're going to have to think about that as we implement or not some of these
But
recommendations.
some of them won't add to costs. I mean, for example, the multi-component units, if you use the same units, I mean, unless you add the units, you won't significantly add to costs. I think some of the things can be done without significantly added costs, and I would hope that when you see the Army's response, that they will identify some of those for you.
I have a follow-on question. In the end, it comes down, in an all-volunteer force and in any Army, it comes down to the people that you're able to attract. And what I'd like to do, one of the recommendations was you want to stop cuts in the overall size of the Army. But even if this was followed, our troop levels will still be at the lowest levels in decades. So that's why I do think that those you do have are of the highest caliber. So how can the Army continue to improve the physical, the psychological, the cognitive, the overall human performance of the force to make sure that those that you're attracting are able to perform at the highest level and you make the most of every soldier?
Well, thanks, ma'am. As you know, that was not a specific charge to the commission to look at that issue. So if you'll allow me to step away from my role as chairman and speak perhaps as some of the things that we observed throughout the force. The young women and men of the Army, all three components, regular Army, Army National Guard, Army Reserve, what we heard loud and clear is that they joined to serve. They want to be utilized. So that's part of, I think, the recruiting and retention challenge for a quality force is use that force. We heard, this is anecdotal, but we heard from a number of young soldiers, mid-grade soldiers, particularly in the reserve components, that if they weren't going to be utilized, if they weren't going to be operationally employed, well, they might choose to do something else. So I think that has an important part of it. I think a second component to successful recruiting and retention is that the young people who we had the great fortune to engage with across the Army, they want to feel like what they're doing makes a difference, that they're making a valuable contribution. Certainly, they're concerned about compensation. That is certainly an important piece of this, but it's not only the piece. It's not the only piece of their sense of service. And so I think it's this combination of challenge, of importance of mission, combined with the proper level of compensation that will allow the Army to continue to attract in an admittedly declining pool of eligible women and men across the country to serve, but will continue to attract the bright young people that the nation needs in its Army to maintain its vitality and effectiveness.
Secretary Hale, do you have any thoughts about it? Yeah. It's not an easy challenge that the Army then has taken on in terms of just making sure it can recruit and retain those that can meet the tests, whatever they may be, and to assure that you have the capabilities you need across the force as well, not just that the individual is feeling well able to contribute to the highest level, but that you're also finding all the talent you need for the specific jobs, and you kind of align them properly.
Yes, ma'am. I think that's right. And of course, the requirements are changing. But I think we found certainly young people with highly technical educational backgrounds that are attracted to work in growing fields such as cyber defense and the like. And so, looking for opportunities to match those skills and attributes that young people bring with the needs of the Army, I think will be a vital component to maintaining the excellence that the Army has achieved over many years. And I would add just one other point is the people who serve, they want to know that they are serving in the world's best Army. That requires a continued emphasis on leader development. It also entails a commitment to modernizing the force to make sure that the soldiers are properly equipped to encounter any potential adversary.
Thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Dr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and General, thank you for your service in uniform and your continued service in retirement, which is not so much of retirement. You're actively working now, and we thank you for that. I was here earlier when you testified, and if I understand correctly, you said that 980,000 is really an absolute floor that we have to operate from, and I assume you also mean 450,000 for the active duty component. Is that still correct?
Doctor, that's correct. So that we were careful in the words that we chose. And so we chose that an Army of 980,000 broken down by components, 450 regular Army, 335 National Guard, 195 in the Army Reserve, is minimally sufficient. Minimally sufficient. We were careful about those words.
So it's really not even close to being ideal, where we really need to be on our manpower strength.
We of course, we're not charged with recommending what might the ideal force be. It was what was the force within acceptable risk and with anticipated resourcing. So that's how we came to that agreement amongst the commission that minimally sufficient was the right descriptor.
Would you comment on the fact that this administration's budget, because of increasing OCO needs, is now wanting to pull OCO out of base budget? Would you like to comment on that and what impact it has on this in-strength number?
Yeah, Doctor, if you'll allow me, I'll make a brief comment and then look to the guy who understands this better than I do. I think one of the challenges with the overseas contingency operations funding is its lack of predictability, and that's why I think that it's important to make sure that there is the right level and a predictable level of funding in the Army's base funding, so that they can undertake many of the modernization efforts that are necessary. As far as the impacts, let me turn to my partner here.
Well, the commission focused on the minimum needed resources, and we really didn't look at how it ought to be funded. And I want to reiterate that we endorsed the fiscal year 16 plan, and we're not on that track now. As you know, the Army is significantly below those resources in this budget because of the bipartisan budget agreement last year. In terms of OCO, if I could follow General Ham and step away a bit from the commission, it has the problems that he just said. You don't want to fund a lot of things in OCO because it's only 1 year at a time, and the department desperately needs to be able to look out over several years in planning programs. That said, if the environment is such that it's the only way to go, at least I personally wouldn't turn it down.
Sure.
I mean, I think we need to, we got to make things work.
Right, excellent. Also, again, back to you, General, the commission cited the unstoppable op tempo within the active component a number of times throughout the report. Could the commission provide some more specifics on what it found on the high rate of deployments, the current small size of the force, and how this has strained the Army?
Yes, sir. So as we engage soldiers across the Army, we found the high operations tempo, rapid deployments below that level, which is optimal for the active component, which would ideally be at least 2 years at home for 1 year operationally deployed. 4 or 5 years at home for the reserve components for every year mobilized or operationally deployed. We found lots of units that were spinning, particularly in the regular Army, spinning faster than that, particularly in certain fields, aviation, missile defense, special forces to be sure, and many others. Part of that, the commission felt, was due to the challenge in assured access and funding to allow reserve component units to perform many of those missions, which they're certainly perfectly capable of performing, but in some cases that requires a bit of additional funding to pay principally the salaries for those mobilized or activated reserve or National Guard soldiers.
Right. Well, let me just say in ending here, I want to thank you again, General Ham, for your position on this, that this is an absolute lower ragged edge, as we often say, that we cannot go below this floor. And really, all things being said, really we need to have better funding and more manpower. But thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Waltz?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for putting the emphasis on this report that it deserves and pointing out some of the critical issues we're going to be tackling here. And to the Commission, I can't thank you enough for the work you did. On behalf of the co-authors, myself, Mr. Graves, Ms. Miller, Mr. Meadows, and former member Hale, who put this in the NDAA, rarely have I seen since I've been here the letter and the intent of congressional intent carried out the way you did it, and so thank you for that. It was to inform us before we made decisions going forward. The number of people you went and spoke to, it's astounding, and I hear feedback all the time, and I want a special thank you from those National Guard folks out in Minnesota that you took the time, you included them in this discussion, and so when you're speaking of these issues, you're speaking exactly the way we're hearing it, about what they want to do. They want to be part of this team. They want, and we deserve to give them the best training, best equipment, and then integrate them into that fight. So, so thank you for that. And it's on that I would segue to, how do we do a better job? Did you come out of anything on that? But maybe both of you, your opinions on this, General Ham. What do you think on integration? We tried this before. We tried integrating battalions in. We took troops out and leaders and embedded them at times. Certainly over the last 10 years, the Guard has picked up their fair share of the missions and done them. But how do we go forward to ensure that this is a part of the strength we need?
Congressman, I'd offer two broad categories of how this might be enhanced in the future. One is there has got to be, from the very top leadership in the Army, from the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff and the Sergeant Major of the Army, this continued emphasis on the total force. There's one Army. It happens to have three distinct, interdependent but essential components. But as General Milley, the Chief of Staff of the Army, points out in many of his public addresses, over every soldier's breast pocket, it says U.S. Army. Doesn't say anything else. It says U.S. Army, irrespective of component. So I think that cultural emphasis by the Army's leadership is important. Having said that, there are some matters in policy and even some in law that would help, in the Commission's view, to further the integration of the three components of the Army. Such as the increased emphasis on the one Army school system, where again, irrespective of component, you're trained and educated. The leader development programs for officers and non-commissioned officers are the same. You grow up in the Army and you have different roles. So that's one area that we think a difference could be made. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, some additional flexibility and indeed some additional resourcing in the Section 12304B authority that allows for the employment of reserve component forces would be helpful, again, I think, in integrating the total force.
I couldn't agree more. The tone at the top is key, and I sense hearing General Milley speak that he does want more integration, and we've heard that privately from him, and I've seen it in his statements. In addition to what General Ham said, there are a couple others I mentioned earlier. I think the Apache transfer itself is a part of the way to, another way to help toward integration, as are multi-component units. I'll mention two others that are in the report. One, an integrated recruiting system. Right now, all three components have their own recruiting system, sometimes even competing with each other. The Commission recommended at least a pilot to look at integrating those. And the Army right now does not have a single pay and personnel system that allows everybody to see each other's when the appropriate security guidelines, obviously. The Integrated Pay and Personnel System, Army, IPSA as it's called, is important, I think, to the overall integration. It's on its way, and I would urge that Congress fund it consistent with it meeting appropriate milestones, but treat it as a high priority project.
Well, I appreciate your thoughtfulness, and I said it's to inform members of this committee and probably more importantly, the folks who aren't on this committee that are in Congress. And I can't stress enough to my colleagues I think many of us are concerned about these end strength numbers, and we're concerned, as we rightfully should be, simultaneously on costs. The Guard and Reserve is a way you can get your cake and eat it too, and if it's done correctly, it has to be a part of this discussion. And so I encourage us to continue to take these recommendations to heart, and the work that you did will inform us as we go forward. You've done a great service, and I appreciate it. I yield back.
Mr. Waltz, I believe you have a unanimous consent request for the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I did have the Reserve Officers Association. I asked for unanimous consent to put their statement in the record. They, too, pretty much echo that, and thank you for what you did, and talk about the one Army total force. So if I could submit that.
Are there any objections?
Thank you,
Without
Chairman.
objection, the statement of the Reserve Officers Association will be included in the record. Turning to Mr. Gibson.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member as well. Thank you for your leadership on this very important issue and holding this hearing. I also want to welcome and express my gratitude to both of our panelists today for their distinguished career serving our servicemen and women and their families. You know, I want to echo the comments, certainly the work of the commission with regard to integrating the force, the total Army. I can recall back, although sometimes it seems like 1,000 years ago, being 17 years old and enlisting as a private E1 in the Army National Guard, serving 5 years there, and then going in the regular Army for 24 years, and then now on this side. And while I think that there's always been good faith efforts to have this one force, I think that the weight of the commission and Congressman Walz, the highest ranking enlisted man to ever serve in these chambers, you know, and his team sponsoring this commission, I think is helpful, particularly when I see the Army leadership coming together and really wanting to do exactly this. I think it's going to be really important, which leads to my next point, and that, Secretary Hale, I thank you for the work that you have done over your career on really bringing efficiencies, the reforms that are necessary, because as you both point out, I mean, we don't, end strength means very little if we have a hollowed out force. We can't have that. We need to have fully trained, equipped, and ready force. And it needs to be right-sized, too, but all that has to come together. So towards that end, you know, I just want to build on some of the earlier testimony, and here I'm just going to ask in your best professional judgment, General Ham, in your case, your best military judgment, when a BCT is stood down and it's completed, how long does it take to turn the light back on? Based on our experiences over the past decade, from the idea to the enunciation to the recruiting to the initial training to the integration in the unit, the training to the deployment into an operational area, how long is that period?
Having some experience, Congressman, in doing this, having stood up an infantry brigade combat team while I was a division commander, I would say at the bare minimum, fully resourced, priority for manning, for equipment, and access to all the right training. I would say 18 months would be an absolute minimum, probably closer to somewhere in the neighborhood of 24 to 36 from a cold start.
Right, so that would be the unit, and I concur. I think that's most of our, and then of course you have just to plan it in, you have to recruit, and then you have to actually get them to basic training and AIT and actually assess them into the unit. So it can take as long as 3 years when you actually put that whole package together. And that's what I want to really put into the record here, is that we're making decisions this year on end strength, and for the American people to know that, you know, this is one that we assume a lot of risk. If we get this wrong, you know, it's not like, oh, well, you know, next month we can just fix that. If we draw down too far, you're looking at a 3-year lag time before we can even recur or we can regain that capability in our armed forces. And you acknowledge and agree?
Yeah, Congressman, I do. It is one of the reasons why we make a number of recommendations with regard to enhancing the readiness of the reserve components, but we also address the issue of expansibility, which has not gotten a lot of attention over the past several years. But there must be processes in place and plans in place so that in the eventuality where the Army is required to expand quickly, we know how to do that. And I think that requires some additional attention.
Indeed, and I noticed that in the commission, and I think that was helpful. I'll lay out a question now, but I then want to move, and we'll see how, if we have any time, we can recur back to it. But what I was interested in from Secretary Hale is, you know, the analysis of, given a scenario where we draw down and then we have to bring a BCT back on active duty, what does that cost? in relation to whatever we think it is that we're saving. But let me move on and see if we have time to go back to that. I do want to ask this question, and that is this. General, in your earlier statement, you talked about impact on troops and families. Thank you for that. And you knew, no one arguably knows that as much as you do. My point I want to get clarification for the record is that's assuming deterrence here. That's assuming, we don't have to go fight one of these major theater wars. If we had to go fight a major theater war, what would the impact then be on families in terms of dwell time, and what would that, because you know very well what that looked like in 07, 08, is troops ended up spending 16 months in theater and 11, 12 months back home, and then we're rotating back. So if you could, for the record, say what the impact would be on troops and families if we do get committed to one theater.
Yeah, Congressman, I would commend to you and to all the members, there is a classified annex to the report that addresses some of those issues in greater detail. But what I would say is that certainly in the case of a full-scale mobilization, where commitment to a large-scale operation in any future theater of war, at the size of the Army that is anticipated, there is no dwell time. So, for the most part, soldiers deploy and they're engaged for the duration. This is a commitment on the parts of soldiers and their families to the defense of the nation, and we've got to make sure that our support for them is commensurate with their commitment.
And I thank you. I think that's a very important point to enter into the record in terms of what the risk we're taking on for troops and families. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Dr. Winship.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank both of you gentlemen for your hard work and the information you've been able to provide us and give us some insight to all these very important matters. I like to think a lot of times about our military force as being a deterrent to our adversaries in many ways, and I was wondering if you could weigh in and maybe comment on where our current state of the Army and the military in general is it serving as a deterrent to our adversaries. And I know we have different types of adversaries today, potential adversaries. There's peer-to-peer nation-type adversaries, and then there's the terrorist-type adversaries. But I wonder if you could comment on where you think we are today as far as being an effective deterrent to actions.
Yeah, Doctor, thanks for that question. I guess I would characterize deterrence in a couple of different ways. One is in the purely military capability and capacity that the nation possesses. That's measurable. It's accessible by force posture and levels of readiness, and that certainly shaped many of our recommendations, particularly with regard to posture overseas in Korea and in Europe, where there are a couple of different recommendations with regard to ground forces and Army aviation forces. But it also, deterrence also is based on elements of will and demonstrated capacity. It's one of the reasons why we think the presence of forces in Korea, and in the case of of Europe, we believe the forward stationing of an armored brigade combat team conveys in very visible terms the will of the nation to commit to deterrence.
And can I just add a thought, and that is, I think where the Army is able to deploy is highly capable. This is a strong Army. The problem is more its capacity, and can it do it in all the potential areas where they might be needed. I think that's the trade, the risks that we take is not having enough to do all of these requirements, meet all of these requirements. Where they are deployed, they're a capable force.
So what I'm reading from that, in general, especially your comments when you talk about Europe, is that we could be a greater deterrent than we currently are.
Doctor, we make a recommendation that gets to the issue of as this Army was sized and planned for the future, the strategic environment is different than it is today. We did not, in most of the plans, we anticipated a very different relationship with Russia than what has evolved over the past couple of years. And we believe that necessitates a relook, a rethinking of our overall strategy for employment of military forces for both deterrence but also of assurance of our allies and partners.
I thank you both very much. I appreciate you being here today and the work that you've done. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go to Mr. Vesey.
Yes, I wanted to ask a specific question about the commission considering the integration of women in the all-male ground combat units and what they think of the recommendations, and if so, what considerations are being made and determined on that issue.
Congressman, let me start and maybe ask Secretary Hale to comment. This obviously was not a specific charge to the commission, and the policy decision to open all specialties to women was made pretty late in the commission's endeavors. Having said that, we did have the opportunity to engage with leaders, with soldiers, both women and men across the force in all three components. And so we had some discussion about this. And I think the first response is one that won't surprise you, Congressman. It was from leaders at all levels that says, if the policy changes, because it was uncertain at that time, if the policy changes, we will embrace it and move out and apply the new policy to the best efforts that we have. I would tell you, again, anecdotally, in engaging with women, particularly young women, both enlisted and officers, there were mixed feelings about their personal interest in serving in the ground combat arms or other specialties which had previously been closed to women, but there was near unanimity in opening the opportunity to women who had the desire to serve in those specialties and the capability to serve in those previously closed specialties. I think we heard loud and clear that there was broad acceptance of the opportunity to do so.
I agree with what General Ham said. I mean, it wasn't a commission issue, but speaking personally, I think it was the right decision. We need to harness all the capability or at least offer the opportunity to harness all the capability we can in the United States military, and this was a move in that direction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go to Ms. McSally, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your service and your hard work on this commission. I want to go back to the Apache transfer and to be full disclosure here, the Silver Bell Army Heliport is just outside my district, and many of the guardsmen live in my district. So any community is going to be concerned if they're hearing that something's going to change, we're going to lose those citizen soldiers from our community. But aside from that, I'm concerned about the operational impact of executing this, and then also the cost, as you mentioned. I've trained a lot as an A-10 pilot with the Apaches. Tremendous location there with the weather and the airspace and the Berry Goldwater ranges, but it's a unit by itself. So I'm assuming if your recommendations are put into place, then we would lose that unit, and that would would be located at some active duty Army base. So they would miss out on the operational strengths of being located where they are. So that's of concern to me, just because of the proximity and the airspace, the weather, the joint training opportunities. But then also, as we've seen units sometimes go from active to Guard or Reserve, you'll see the expertise that we have of the pilots potentially flowing into the Guard and Reserve from active duty, so you can retain that expertise. But if you're going in the other direction, I'm assuming you thought through, it's not likely to have a bunch of Guard pilots want to transition back to active duty. They have other jobs, they're rooted in the community. So just the execution of that sounds very cumbersome to me, and also we might lose operational capability, certainly lose tremendous expertise if we go forward with your recommendations. It's not clear to me whether you're recommending with the 4 units staying in the Guard, would the training capability stay in the Guard and the operational capability be in active duty, just to clarify that. And then I do want to clarify, obviously there's cost that comes with that. So what was the logic behind making a recommendation that is increasing costs, and could you clarify again what those costs are?
So let me start, and then we'll turn to Secretary Hale, who chaired the Aviation Subcommittee. Firstly, ma'am, we did not make any recommendations with regard to which units might be affected. We think that's left best to the Army. We did, as the as the law required us to do, we did in fact actually look at the process by which Army National Guard forces are allocated amongst the states and territories, and found with some minor recommendations, mostly administrative, that process was pretty sound. So I think the Commission has full confidence that if this recommendation is adopted, there's a good process to determine which units might be affected. Secondly, let me say that the recommendation doesn't change the number of battalions that were intended to remain in the regular Army. Under the Aviation Restructure Initiative, it would be 20 battalions. Our recommendation keeps that same number in the regular Army, but adds 4 battalions into the Army National Guard. That's over and above the Aviation Restructure Initiative. The intent was that those 4 Army National Guard battalions would be fully manned, but they would be equipped only with 18 Vice 24 aircraft. That's largely in acknowledgement of the added cost that would be required. But when those battalions would be mobilized and operationally employed, they would cross-level amongst units, a practice which the National Guard is quite familiar with. Chief of the National Guard Bureau, Director of the Army National Guard have advised the committee during its work that they are comfortable with that level of cross-leveling, so that when one of the 4 Army National Guard battalions would be operationally employed, it would go as a full-up battalion with its own personnel, but with aircraft from additional battalion or from additional units. With regard to the cost, let me turn to the cost expert.
We looked at 4 criteria before I get to the costs, or one of them was cost. 1, wartime capacity in a key scenario that's stressful to the Apaches. Second, a surge capability across a variety of scenarios. Third, how do they help in peacetime, or how does it do in peacetime? And finally, costs. I won't go through all of the options, but the commission option ranked better of those we looked at in terms of wartime capacity. It had somewhat more surge capability than the Army's initiative, and it offers some opportunity if these units are used, and we certainly hope they would be, to help in the peacetime as well. That brings us to costs. It does cost more, about $165 million a year in operating costs, and a one-time cost in procurement to remanufacture more Apaches to the E model of about $400 million. We did offer offsets. They're illustrative. We recognize that, and I mentioned earlier, they involve 2 fewer units of Black Hawks helicopters, the assault helicopter, and a modest slowdown in the modernization program for Black Hawks. Black Hawks are important, but we felt that it was more important to have a balanced force with some more Apache capability, even if we had to pay for it through modest changes in the Black Hawk program. So we tried to look at a broad criteria that included cost, but it wasn't solely cost.
So did the criteria include the potential loss of expertise and having to rebuild some of that expertise in the active Army for the experience you'll lose?
Well, as General Ham said, we would keep all 20 battalions that are currently in the Army, Apache battalions that are currently in the Army. So we shouldn't lose any capability there. It'll be the same battalions, and they'll be recruiting for them. Yeah. We would keep some ability for the Guard to be a repository of talent when Apache pilots leave. If they want to stay in the Guard, they would have the opportunity to do that under the Commission's proposal. So we'd have some more capability there, but the same in the active.
Okay, great, thanks. My time's expired. Thank you.
Gentle Lady yields back. Ms. Bordile.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. General Ham and Mr. Hale, I thank you both for your work on this informative commission report. General Ham, a number of the Commission's recommendations focused on total force integration, preparing and leveraging the reserve component as an operational force, including increasing the annual number of Army National Guard combat training center rotations. Now, if that were to be implemented, how can Congress ensure that the readiness built through the rotations is best maintained and best capitalized during the unit's on year if these units are not deploying as they have in past years?
It's a great question, ma'am. And if you'll allow me, let me offer an example that we came across. We visited the 116th Brigade Combat Team based in Idaho, but with units from many, many different states. during their training at the National Training Center, Fort Irwin, California. That unit, all of those units in that brigade, had spent a considerable number of days, many more than the 39 minimum number of days each year. Some of those soldiers had 50 or 60 days in the years leading up to year leading up to their National Training Center rotation, and they voiced the same concern that you did as they exited the National Training Center at the peak of their readiness. They said, "But we're going home. We want to be used. We're trained. We're ready." And so that was a large part of why we recommended increased use of the 12304B authority, why we increased continued reliance on the operational capabilities that are resident in the reserve components of the Army to capitalize on that investment in readiness that the Army had made. The soldiers saw it, the leaders of that unit saw it, and I have confidence that the leadership of the Army, the Secretary and the Chief of Staff and the Sergeant Major of the Army are recognizing that as well and say, we simply cannot afford to train units for training's sake. We have to train and build readiness so that those forces can be operationally employed across the Army's needs.
Thank you. Did you want to add to that, Mr.?
I agree with that.
All right. Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Bridenstine for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for the great work you've done on the National Commission on the Future of the Army. I know we're going to hear from a lot of stakeholders on it, but I think on balance, it's a lot of very good recommendations that this committee is going to have to take very seriously and move forward where we can. I wanted to talk to you for a second about some of the short-range air defense and field artillery concerns. General Ham, the Commission found unacceptable shortfalls in the short-range air defense and field artillery. Fort Sill is in my home state of Oklahoma, the Fires Center of Excellence, and of course it's the Army's home of air defense and artillery. When you think about how important this is to the Army, a couple of things that were mentioned in the National Commission on the Future of the Army were the threats from unmanned aerial systems and cruise missiles. Could you maybe take some time and explain to this committee why it is so important that we make sure that we're taking into account short-range air defense and field artillery?
Thanks, Congressman. First of all, I would commend to you the classified annex that has some further detail about the threats that are posed by potential adversaries in this domain, and I think it is important to this discussion. At an unclassified level, I would go back to a previous comment that said when the Army that we have today was planned and structured, we did not envision the nature of the threat environment in which the Army must operate today. As one example, we did not anticipate that there would be many places in the world where the Army might operate where they would be subjected to threats by enemy air forces, either manned or unmanned or cruise missiles. That's in large testament to the extraordinary capability of the world's finest Air Force to do that. But the threat situation has evolved. And I would highlight, particularly as we have seen integrated air defenses in Syria, as we have seen Russia's employment of both manned and unmanned systems in eastern Ukraine, it presents a different operating environment than that which was envisioned. And we believe that the Army needs to take note of that and restore some capability within the force to counter those measures.
So could you maybe share, is the concern on the shortfall, is it primarily modernization? Is it munitions? Is it manning? Is it doctrine? What is can you be more clear on what that shortfall might be? All of the above?
It's a little bit of all of the above. It's structure and modernization. As one example, for very sound reasons, the Army has made a decision that all of its short-range air defense battalions reside in the reserve components. There are none in the regular Army. At the time, that made a lot of sense. In our view, it doesn't make a lot of sense today. So there is a structure issue there as well. There certainly is a modernization component to this as unmanned systems, smaller systems, more sophisticated adversary capabilities present themselves on potential battlefields. So there is a modernization aspect to this as well.
One of the things we've heard General Milley say, he stated on multiple occasions that the Guard should get at least 2 additional combat training center rotations in this year's budget. Do you agree with that?
Congressman, we did not specify a number. We think that's best left for the Army, but we certainly do believe that it is that the number of reserve component combat training center rotations should be increased, importantly, but without diminishing, decreasing the number of regular Army rotations.
Okay. Well, that makes, and you think it is possible to do more for the Guard and not decrease the regular Army rotations?
In our assessment, yes, it is.
Okay. One other question I had was the recommendation to eliminate 2 regular Army IBCTs, and ultimately, did you consider other areas where you could find 8,500 people, or how did you come to the assessment that infantry brigade combat teams is where that number needed to come from?
Some of the details would be in the classified annex, Congressman, but in general, what I would say is that while infantry brigade combat teams certainly are stressed in any potential operational theater of war, they were less stressed than many other capabilities. And so we felt that we had to make at least some offer to say, if you have to make these very, very difficult decisions to increase some of the shortfalls in other capabilities, that this was a consideration, recognizing how difficult that decision might be.
We did look at a number of other potential efficiencies. We didn't study them in detail, but I think and they'll be familiar to you, most of them have been proposed. Healthcare reform, for example, the always difficult but important issue of closing unneeded facilities, and the integrated recruiting system that the Commission recommended wasn't recommended primarily to save money, but it would potentially save some dollars. So we did look at some other areas.
Did you guys look at the Army Service Component Commands, the 9 different Army Service Component Commands, as a place to find personnel?
We did look at the Army Service Component Commands and spoke with them and with the combatant commanders that they support, but not so much in terms of potential space savings. While certainly there might be some utility in that, but it is important that the Army service components, at least under current law and policy, that's the mechanism by which combatant commanders access Army capabilities.
Right.
So diminishing that brings some risk with it as well.
And just real quick, did you guys look at Army Materiel Command?
We did not take a deep dive into Army Materiel Command, principally because it is a largely civilian entity.
Okay.
So we didn't look at that as a potential space savings.
The chairman is telling me I'm out of time, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Good work. Time expired. We'll go to Mr. Whitman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for your efforts there with the Commission. I wanted to begin speaking from my perspective as Readiness Subcommittee Chairman in saying that I wholeheartedly agree with your recommendation number 7 in the report that says the Army must continue to treat readiness as its most important funding priority. That is in line with what we've heard from senior Army officials, including General Milley, the Army Chief of Staff, who has repeatedly said that readiness is number 1 and there is no other number 1. Secondly, I want to concur with recommendation number 14 that said the Army should forward station an armored brigade combat team in Europe. There's probably no other statement in the Commission's report that acknowledges the changed strategic situation in Europe better than that recommendation. And in your report, you quote EUCOM Commander General Breedlove as saying virtual presence by U.S. forces will be translated by both friends and adversaries as actual absence. And while we know the rotating U.S. forces into and out of Europe as we do now has significant value, we definitely need armor back in Europe, and that is needed because it is a credible deterrent to Vladimir Putin's ambitions. The fact is we have no armored unit stationed in Europe anymore, and as I visited the Baltic states last summer to observe firsthand the impact of the European Reassurance Initiative, the Prime Minister of Estonia, I think, put it best when he told our delegation, deterrence is preferable to having to be liberated. And with Prime Minister Ravos there giving us that perspective and having the longest period of time of independence for Estonia, I think those are very prophetic words. And finally, like all of my colleagues, I have serious reservations that the size of the total Army, especially the active duty Army, is enough at the current levels being proposed to fulfill all of its missions. And the report states that for some potential challenges, the Army might have capability and capacity shortfalls and will be forced to deploy units not fully ready, which would not be acceptable. Pretty plain and straightforward. On the next page, it states, even assuming full access to all Army components, this force size provides only limited ability to react to unforeseen circumstances. And the report goes on to say that under current strategic guidance, the Army and other defense components are directed not to size themselves for large-scale, long-duration stability operations. Yet, the other direction is to conduct current stability and counterinsurgency operations, and that's stated as one of the top elements in the Joint Force Prioritized Missions as described in the National Military Strategy of 2015. So those two statements are at counter purposes. So not only is the 980,000 total Army at the minimum sufficient strength necessary to meet challenges of the future strategic environment as stated in the report, it only barely meets that requirement when we wish away valid and required missions. And I think we have to be realistic about saying we can't change the mission sets to meet what we wish is provided for us on the resource side. And I understand wanting to try to take the 450 number and shoebox it into something that'll fit, but I just don't believe that that is where we need to be directing this discussion. And my question is this: is it safe to assume that if the Army had included sizing for stability operations, the requirement for more IBCTs and enablers, that the number would be significantly higher than the 980,000 total recommended in the report? General Ham?
Yeah, Congressman, thanks. So again, the two parts of guidance in the law that were so important to us were size and force mix at acceptable levels of risk and consistent with anticipated levels of resourcing. So as I mentioned, if you alter one or both of those parameters, you would get a very, very different answer. Mm-hmm. So if you were not budget constrained, I suspect the Commission would have come in with a much larger number. Mm-hmm. Or if you had said, minimum levels of risk, you might get a very, very different number. I think, Congressman, what you speak to highlights the requirement to continually assess the evolving security environment in which Army forces will be applied. Again, in our judgment, the numbers are what we think are consistent with the charge that you gave us in the law. Mm-hmm. If you tinker with either of those, I think we would have had a very different outcome.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Hale?
Just like to repeat what I've said earlier, we're off track from even the Commission's recommendation in the latest budget. We recommended the fiscal 16 budget request. We're somewhat below that, probably $5-6 billion below it for Army, and below it also for some of the other services. So I think the first thing we need to do is try to get back on that track, and then we'll go from there.
Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, I just want to ask one quick question with a yes or no answer. Would you state then that under the current conditions we find today, that an Army of 450,000 would be insufficient to properly manage risk and to address the threats we see before us today?
If greater resources were available, I would agree with that. At the current level of resources, I'll stand by the Commission's recommendation.
Mr. Hale?
I agree.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll go to Mr. Kaufman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my question to you is concerning pushing more capability to the Guard and Reserve to achieve cost savings. I think if you look at the cost of I've read analysis where the cost of a Sergeant E5 in the Army, and if you take Sergeant E5 in the Reserve or Guard, that non-deployed, it's about a third of the cost. And then when you take, and that's discounting the legacy cost of retirement. And so that individual, when retired, will not draw until age 60, the Guard and Reserve, and the active duty will draw, they could draw as young as probably 37, 38 years old, with 20 years in would be the youngest, probably certainly not the average. And so I'm just wondering, do we need a separate analysis, or do you think you press that issue in terms of shifting capability to the Guard and Reserve in order to retain, to where we obviously not compromising capability, but to kind of bend the cost curve in terms of personnel costs? I'll start with General Ham, you first.
Thanks, Congressman. We purposely did not seek to replow the ground that the Compensation Commission and others have looked at in this regard, but we certainly heard lots of testimony related to the points that you raised, that before mobilization or activation, certainly reserve component soldiers are less costly. We looked at it from the Commission's standpoint more in terms of the operational capability that would be required to meet the nation's objectives of the Army, and that's what led us to the force sizing recommendations that we made. But it is important that 450 in the regular Army, 335 in the National Guard, 195 in the Reserve is only sufficient if you properly train, modernize, and operationally employ those forces. If you put them on the shelf and don't modernize them, then the reserve components will not be ready to answer the call. So it is, again, it's more than just the size number. It's the full package of training and modernization.
I think you would, and I would agree with you, and I think you would have to restructure the Guard and Reserve in order to accomplish that. We don't want to go back to what happened during the first Gulf War, where you had an entire, I think, Army National Brigade that was deemed unfit to deploy, and so but I just think we've got to press that issue, and maybe we have to rethink it in a broader way to where do we want to maintain them as an operational reserve, where they're going to be deployed to active duty maybe on an every 5-year basis or something like that for a limited period of time, as opposed to bringing them back to a strategic reserve and having a concern about their combat effectiveness being degraded. Mr. Hale.
So you cited a common figure of about a third. It varies to more like a third to two-thirds the cost. The aviation units are probably in the Guard, even when not deployed, about two-thirds the cost, or 60, 70% as much. But the key here is the regular Army can do some things the Guard just can't realistically do. They can deploy early in a war. I'll use the Apaches as a good example because we looked at them with care. We've got shortfalls in a key scenario early in the war, and that convinced, and only the active or the regular Army can help there. That convinced us to leave the number of active battalions at 20, but we're also short actually a little more later in the war. That is a capability that Guard can supply, and that's why part of the reason we recommended keeping 4 battalions of Apaches in the Guard. So it's a capability cost trade-off, as you know, and I think the Commission did its best and came up with the proposal that General Ham has discussed, and I certainly share that as being the right way to go.
Sure. Again, you didn't take into, I agree with you that certain units are more expensive than others based on the active duty component that's required to support the reserve unit. But again, we're not taking into account legacy costs, and I think that full analysis needs to be done in terms of costs. And I also think that there are a lot of specialty areas that have a direct correlation to an occupation in the civilian world that where we don't necessarily need that full capability, except in a full mobilization, and yet we maintain surplus capacity on the active duty side. I'm thinking about medicine as an example. Whenever I go to Bethesda, when I went to Bethesda in 2011, there was a very significant patient flow there coming out of Afghanistan. When I go there now, they're looking for patients, and so we're treating patients from the Boston bombing. They're bringing in veterans with non-service connected issues just to try and maintain a certain level of capability. And so I think that's something where we ought to look at plussing up the Guard and Reserve and then bringing on when we mobilize. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Songus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on an earlier question and focus it a little differently. You know, as we are talking about end strength and what the proper number is, I think what we're all concerned with is the resiliency of the force and the pressures that come to bear, given the multiple challenges. And I've seen in Massachusetts where there's been a lot of research investment in sort of making just better understanding, as I said, how you improve the physical, the psychological, the cognitive, the overall human performance of the force, with the interest of and understanding the inordinate number of pressures that come to bear on those who do serve. And my question really is, do you see value in that going forward, as we're still, no matter what, but in a constrained environment where we ask ever more of those who are serving? Do you see value in that kind of research and development effort?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. In two ways. One is simply from a readiness standpoint. We want to make sure that that soldiers are as ready as they can be, and as you indicate, that's more than just technical or tactical training or other means of readiness, but it is readiness of the whole person that is vitally important. So that I think from a purely readiness standpoint, that's quite important. In perhaps a less objective measure, it is also I think integral to recruiting and retaining the quality people that we need. To know that when they raise their right hand and enlist in the Army or are commissioned as an officer in the Army, that they are joining a profession that will attend to their needs and make sure that they are properly cared for and they are as capable and as ready to perform at maximum levels as is possible. And it also sends a very clear message to their families that we will care for your soldier when the worst possible things that can happen to soldiers happen, that their families have confidence that the Army will take care of them in those dire circumstances. So for those reasons, I think the points you mentioned are absolutely essential.
Thank you. Secretary Hale, do you? No. The other question is, we've been debating end strength here, and I think we're all concerned about what the appropriate number is. But if you look at the current situation, we have soldiers of the U.S. Army deployed in over 140 countries around the world. Some are obviously engaged in the fight. Some are there in a deterrence mode. Other are there just to reassure allies and partners. And as we struggle with fiscal constraints, did you at all consider whether or not the Army is spread too thin, and should we be better channeling those that we do have in order to, for example, reduce the pressure on the deployed soldier and give them more dwell time? Was that part of your consideration?
It was, ma'am, and in fact, the law required us to look at that. I think in a general sense, the Commission's view was one of the very best ways to alleviate the frequent operational deployments, particularly within the regular Army, is to ensure that the reserve components of the Army are adequately trained, modernized, and prepared so that they can become more operationally employed. It has the value of relieving a little bit of operational stress on the regular force, but it also builds operational capability within the reserve components. And ma'am, we heard loud and clear from those soldiers in the Army Reserve and Army National Guard that they have a burning desire to be operationally employed.
So you didn't see it as sort of retooling what the Army should be doing and where, but rather how you do it and who you have do it?
Well, certainly a mix of both. I think the demands from the combatant commands, for the most part, are increasing. There are systems within the Army and within the Joint Staff and the Office of the Secretary of Defense to prioritize and balance those demands. The demands will probably almost always exceed the supply, so it is a matter of prioritization. And I think in general, the Commission's view was that if the Army can more effectively employ the operational forces in the Army National Guard and Army Reserve, that'll go a long way toward meeting that demand and relieving some of the stress that is evident in some communities in the regular Army.
So you really
I'd just
didn't
like to add to
consider-
that, if I
Oh,
might. I fully agree. We need to use the Guard and the Reserve. We tried in the Commission to put our money where our mouth was on this one. For example, when we suggested keeping 4 battalions or recommended keeping 4 battalions in the Guard, we included in the cost the added cost to call them up on the 1 to 5 basis. That is one of the planning scenarios. And similarly, you've heard us say before, we recommended more funding for this 12304B, which provides funds to call up the Guard and the Reserve. We repeatedly heard that the reason they're not used more is not that they don't want to go, it's that there isn't the funds to pay for them when they're called to active duty. So we tried to, as I say, put our money where our mouth is. We need to use the Guard and the Reserve, and we need to fund it.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. This concludes our questions. Any concluding remarks from our panelists? Give you the opportunity at this point.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would conclude simply by again thanking you and Ms. Zongas for the opportunity to come appear before the committee. And I would hearken back to a comment Mr. Hale mentioned earlier in his testimony. The United States Army is the finest Army in the world. It's got some challenges, and we certainly need to be careful as we proceed, but there should be no question that this is the premier land force on the face of this planet today, and that's thanks to the great women and men who every day choose to serve this nation in uniform.
I would just like to take this opportunity to thank the guy to my right here. General Ham did a great job. He earned a merit badge in herding cats, which is one of the requirements if you, I think, are chairman of a commission. He really did a good job in bringing us together and focusing on the key issues. So thank you, and thanks also to the staff, some of whom are behind me, who did an outstanding job helping us get through a tough set of issues.
Well, I thank you both, and please do convey to all those on the commission how much all of us here deeply appreciate their commitment to our country and the recommendations that they've provided. And with that, that closes the hearing. Thank you very much.